Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I want to talk about the Alpha Quadrant book for Star Trek Adventures. It is super awesome. This is my Star Trek book, so to speak. Not that I had any hand in it, but that Deep Space Nine is my favorite series. Cardassians are my favorite aliens. Uh, this is the book that I have been waiting for ever since I realized how awesome this game was when I read the core book, and I wanted more. So, the bulk of it, as you can guess by the cover there with Deep Space Nine all over it, deals very heavily with and primarily with the Cardassians and the Bajorans. And the book goes into extensive detail on Cardassia and Bajor and their, you know, associated environs. It talks about Deep Space Nine a little bit, and you get some stats and you get some stuff. It talks about the wormhole a little bit, but if you want, Jem'Hadar and Vorta and Changelings, founders and stuff, all that, you're going to need the Gamma Quadrant book. What this really focuses in is the Cardassian Union itself and Bajor. And so the Bajorans, like I said, they're my favorite aliens in Star Trek. Second only to the Klingons, they have more knowledge, they have more backstory, we know more about them than any other species, including the Romulans, who've been around way longer. The Cardassians have, they are portrayed most of the time as villains, but they are very rich, layered villains who, the more you understand about who they are and what they've gone through and where they've come from, they start to become much more empathetic and much more round as characters. And this book really delves into that aspect of the Cardassians. It's not just, hey, look at these bad guys. They're not orcs, they're not trolls, they're people. And you get to know so much about where they come from, why they think the way they think. You are guaranteed, even if you're a huge Star Trek nerd like me, to learn some cool new things about Cardassian culture in this book, and that's awesome. Similarly, the book gives so much information about Bajor and the Bajorans. Uh, and it establishes right off the bat in the very first part when it talks about Bajorans that there's really three Bajors. There's before, during, and after the occupation. They were a peaceful people, very religious, very spiritual, very musical, very pastoral, and then they had this horrible 50-year occupation that decimated their planet, obliterated their culture, uprooted and changed everything. And so now, in the aftermath of that, the Bajorans are trying to reconcile these two sides of who they are. Some of them want to go back to these old, peaceful, mystical ways. Some of them are like, no, the occupation made us stronger and we were only able to survive because of what we turned into. We can't lose that, or we'll just get run over by the next group that comes through. And so there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of, again, depth and layer and texture to their culture. The fact that these two cultures, Cardassia and Bajor, get so much detail, that they are so complicated and complex, is a big part of what made Deep Space Nine such an incredible series. If you are looking to infuse a lot of interesting culture and political and religious stuff into your Star Trek Adventures game, you cannot do better than this. It is just absolutely filled with awesome stuff. That said, there's lots of other things to look at as well. So in addition to Cardassia Bajor, we also have a huge section in this book about Ferenginar and the Ferengi and what their culture is like. And again, as with the Cardassians, we see that they're not just the one-sided villains we sometimes think they are. They're the weaselly little guys who always want money, but why are they like that? How are they like that? Where did they come from? Where do these beliefs come from? And the more you understand them, you can see them from the inside and go, oh, actually, they are much more interesting, and you can do a lot with them. So the Ferengi are great. We also get some of the other kind of major player character races, so to speak. People who have been main characters on the show, like the Trill and Beta Z, Denobula, that was the doctor from Enterprise, You get to learn a lot more about Denobulan culture in the book, which is great. It also includes a section on the Tellarites, and I love the Tellarites because they're so important to the Federation, but they're very rarely explored. And the reason for that, well, let's say first of all, the Tellarites are one of the 4 founding nations, founding species of the Federation. There were humans, Vulcans, Andorians, and Tellarites. We see the other 3 all the time. How come we don't see Tellarites very often? Well, because in the original series, they looked like this. You know, kind of this obvious rubber pig mask with hair on it. And nobody really got excited about exploring what those people were like. And so they just kind of got swept under the rug and forgotten. But the Enterprise series delved into them and took the chance to redesign their physical look in the same way that you know, the movies redesigned the Klingons. And so this is kind of the new Tellarite. That guy looks awesome. Much more of a gruff, you know, fearsome, venerable, respectable, almost like a space dwarf in the same way that Vulcans are sort of kind of like space elves. And there's even variants, you know, in the same sense that the Tellarites kind of have a piggish look to them. Some of them have more of a boarish look to them, where they've got the big tusks coming out. And there's a couple of different pictures you can find of that. So I think the Tellarites are super cool, and I'm glad that this book includes a whole section about them. So hooray for that! Now, those are the Tsenkethi, but we're going to get to them later. Let's talk about some of the new species you can play. Tellarites were already included in the core book, so were Bajorans, but Cardassians were not. Now they're here. Finally, you can play Cardassian characters, which is all I ever play when I play Star Trek. Ferengi are finally here. There are 11 new species. Some of them I think are not nearly as cool. There's Aurelians, which are like the bird people that you should see like in the backgrounds of some of the movies and stuff. There are, you know, Katarians, which, yes, some of the characters, you know, we know who Katarians are, but they're not all that thrilling. On the other hand, we get Caitians, which are super neat. Let me find you a picture of some Caitians. They're cat people. Star Trek has 2 canonical cat people species, and Caitians are one of them. Look at that. They've just really leaned into the fact that is straight up your house cat in a Star Trek uniform. So if you like cat people, guess what? You can be one in Star Trek now. So hooray for the Alpha Quadrant Sourcebook. So Ferengi, Cardassia, Caitians, those are the main ones. But there's 8 other new species, and they're all cool, whether you want to use them or not. Now there's also new starships. And so we get 2 or 3 new starships each for the Cardassians, for the Ferengi, for the Breen, for the Talarians. Who remembers the Talarians? Nobody. They're in like 2 episodes of Next Gen. The Tholians. We surprisingly do not get some of the Tsenkethi, which is what I was just about to talk about, and didn't. Let's talk about the Tsenkethi. So the Alpha Quadrant is very different from the Beta Quadrant in that it has a different feel to it. The Beta Quadrant is primarily comprised of the Federation, the Klingons, and the Romulans. And then if you go, you know, way past the Romulans, there's the Shackleton Expanse, which is kind of undefined wilderness without a lot in it. So if you want Cold War stuff, the Beta Quadrant is for you. The Alpha Quadrant is very different. Instead of 3 giant forces of relatively equal strength, there are a bunch of smaller kind of villain groups, which makes it a much more, less of a Cold War and more of like a Wild West frontier. You're out there, you know, doing your best, and then you get to the edge of Federation space and you find the Cardassians, but then you also find the Breen. They were this kind of autocratic fascist group that allied with the Dominion. And they've got very strange technology, and they're kind of menacing and evil. You've got the Tholians. They were a species from original series. You know, if you've seen the Tholian web, where there's that big, giant, just kind of hex wall in space, just unimaginably massive, that's the Tholians who made that thing. And the video game, Star Trek Online, has actually done a lot to make the Tholians more usable and more active in the universe. They have very strange technology, they have very strange biology, but there's a lot you can do with them, and this book gives you the tools to do that. There's stats for their people, stats for their ships, lots of fun things you can do. So hooray for the Tholians. And then last of all, of course, is the Tzenkethi. The Tzenkethi are interesting in that they're kind of new. They were mentioned a couple of times in, the old Star Trek series, but they've never been depicted on screen. And so we don't know what they look like. And this book also doesn't depict them. It has a verbal description of what they look like, but does not include an image anywhere, which is super weird, which is why I've got this to show you. So this is from Star Trek Online. In one of the Star Trek Online major storyline updates, the Tzenkethi are the primary bad guys. And so they did a bunch of design work for them. And that was, in fact, the first design work ever done on the Tzenkethi to determine what they look like. And so you can't see super great. It's, a bunch of big, tough dudes in armor. This is some concept art that shows you a little better what you're looking at. They've got, these big kind of elephant, rhino, brontosaurus feet. They've got tails back there. Two sets of arms, big hulking ones, and then smaller kind of precise work ones. And then they've got some horns, and they've got some protrusions, and they've got this big bulbous head right here. They're kind of neat looking, which is why it's extra sad that they didn't get a picture in the book. But they do get described in the book, which is awesome. What they do not have in this book are any stats for their starships, which is weird because there is a picture of the starship. They've got a picture of the ship with no stats, and then they've got stats for the people, but no pictures. The starship, let me show you. This, again, is from Star Trek Online, and this is a really neat, in-depth article from one of their graphic designers and concept artists who is kind of designing what the Tzenkethi starships look like. And you can see they're these kind of blunt things. This is actually the back end, and this is the front. They went out of their way to make them look almost like hard carapace shell things. They're very brutal and blunt. We'll scroll down. You can see some of the work they're doing here. And then the final result is, this is the battleship right here. And this is the Dreadnought, which is kind of like a battleship with wings. There is a picture of the Dreadnought in the book, and it looks awesome. And then they've got this little drone thing down here, which is a smaller kind of fighter ship. And so the Tzenkethi ships look really cool, and the people look really cool, and yet you kind of have a fairly incomplete depiction of them in the source book, which is too bad because I think they look really great, and they are very fun villains to deal with and to include in your game. So hooray for the Tzenkethi, boo for not having starship stats for them. But there's a lot of stats for a lot of other things. Now, the final and maybe greatest, second to the Cardassian and Bajor cultural stuff, the greatest, most useful thing in this book are the 3 encounter and adversary sections at the end. There's one that talks about the demilitarized zone. Let's get a look at the demilitarized zone. So in the front and back of the book, you've got this thing. And this right here, this kind of weird yellow tube, that is the demilitarized zone. And that is the space in between Federation and Cardassian space that is contested. And if you remember your old next-gen episodes and the character Ro Laren, there were a lot of, there's a really neat storyline in Next Gen that introduced the Bajorans because a lot of them were being displaced when that demilitarized zone was established. And so this encounter section of the demilitarized zone includes Federation colonists, Federation border agents, Cardassian officers, and the Maquis. The Maquis were a group of freedom fighters and rebels and terrorists who were trying to fight against both the Cardassians and the Federation because they were being displaced and because they were losing their homes and because they disagreed with all these policies from both sides. The second of these encounter sections is the Badlands, which is a section, and we can show it right here. It's this big giant pink thing right in the middle. You can see that it is just kind of in between Federation and Cardassian space. It's a little north, so to speak, of Deep Space Nine. The Badlands are sort of kind of a nebula area where sensors don't work really well, which makes it a great place for criminals to hide out. And so the section on the Badlands includes a ton of Maquis, pirates and smugglers, freedom fighters, spies, including some named characters from the series, like Rebecca Sullivan, Michael Eddington, and Thomas Riker, who were fun to have in the show. And now you've got stats for them, and you can include them in your game, which is awesome. Last of all is the Federation border. That whole thing, like we were talking about before, the Alpha Quadrant is a frontier between settled Federation space, settled, so to speak, and then all of these various nefarious factions. And so this is where, in this final section, you get stats for the Breen soldiers, for Ferengi pirates, for Gorn raiders. The Gorn are the great big lizard people that, Captain Kirk very famously had a fist fight with one. There's the Nausicaan raiders and marauders. There's the Tsenkethi themselves. There's 3 or 4 stat blocks for them. So if you want to include any of these many, many different kinds of bad guys in your game, there's all these stats for them. And of course, this being Star Trek, you don't have to treat them as bad guys. This is an opportunity for diplomacy, for combat, for exploration. Pretty much any kind of story you want to tell can be told in the Alpha Quadrant really well, with cool adversaries and cool, alliances and all of this other great stuff. So, hooray! It is an awesome book. Now, there are 2 things on the map that I want to show you before we end. So this is the Alpha Quadrant, right? Back of the book has, and note where the Tsenkethi coalition is right here, because we're going to go up. Top half of that map is in the back, and you can see the Tsenkethi coalition down bottom, right over here. Yep. Anyway, right here. I'm trying to do this backwards. Above them, you see, you go all the way up, there's the Ferengi, you go up even further, there's the First Federation, and then over here is the Patriarchy. What on earth are the First Federation and the Patriarchy? This book does not tell you. They take up tons of real estate on that map, but they're not included in the book. Why? Because they're both weird, and let's talk about them. You need a kind of a big Star Trek nerd to know what either of those things are. Lucky for you, I'm a big Star Trek nerd. So let's talk first about the Patriarchy. We'll go back to the internet and we'll have a look at the Patriarchy. This comes from old school Trek, when they were making the original series, and some of the writers, including Gene Roddenberry, were big fans of Larry Niven and his known space universe. And so when they were doing the animated series, which is considered canon, they included a Larry Niven species called the Kazin. And in Star Trek, they call them the Kazinti. And so they actually, the silly pink uniforms were because the art director for the animated series was colorblind. I'm not making that up. Anyway, the Kazinti are the other canonical cat people species in Star Trek. They're very glory and honor bound. There's some good evidence that the reimagined Klingons, when we got to the movie era, were kind of based on the Kazin in some sense. Anyway, basically what happened is they included them in the animated series in one episode called The Slaver Weapon. And they are canonically a part of Star Trek, but they're also part of Larry Niven's known universe series, and they are his intellectual property, which means anytime they use them in Star Trek, they have to pay him some money, which is why, after that one episode of animated series, they never used them again until Picard. There's one episode of the Picard series that referenced them, and that's because they called up the Larry Niven estate and got special permission to do so. And so the Kazin are technically part of the Star Trek universe, but they also get excluded from it all the time for legal intellectual property reasons. And so they exist in this weird space where they show up on the map, but then they don't get explained or depicted, or they don't get stats. They're not really a part of the universe, really. And so they're in a weird space. That said, there have always been Star Trek writers that are huge fans of them. There was a guy named Jimmy Diggs who worked on the TV series, and he loved them. Michael Chabon, who works on Picard, he loves them, which is why he sneaked that reference in there. So you can use them if you want. They're part of Star Trek, but you don't get any help from the books, from the TV show, from anything else, because they can't afford to include them in any of their products. So anyway, that's what the patriarchy is. Now, what is the First Federation? That also goes back to an old original series episode called the Corbomite Maneuver. The Corbomite Maneuver, I think, is arguably the single most Star Trek-y episode of Star Trek. If you take everything that Star Trek is and represents and stands for and condense it into one episode, you'll get either Devil in the Dark or Corbomite Maneuver, or possibly both. And this is an episode in which the Enterprise is tooling around in space. They cross some invisible border, and immediately a giant ship shows up. Big round orange ball called Fesarius that says, hey, you're in our space, and you will now be destroyed. And so Captain Kirk and the crew are locked into this kind of very tense negotiation where they're doing what they can to survive, and it's all about bluffing. It's all about order of, chain of command. It's all about first contact with alien species. It's all about, all of these, interesting scientific ideas, science fictional premises, ideals about how people should act and behave. They're all kind of locked in there. So that's what the First Federation is. Now, the way they are depicted here on the map, they've got a bunch of, I don't know how well you can see that, but they've got a bunch of red things around them, which implies that you can't actually go there. That's not really true. The shows talk about the First Federation here and there. For example, there is a beverage called Tranya that gets mentioned several times over the course of a couple of different series. So clearly there's some open trade between the Federation and the First Federation. But I guess there's not a lot of story opportunities because they did not get included in the book either, even though they're a big, huge part of the map. So anyway, if you want to include the First Federation or the Patriarchy and the Kazin as part of your Star Trek Adventures game, you can. They're there, but you have to do all that work yourself. So anyway, there's a couple of things that have been left out of this book. But other than that, this book is very complete. It has a lot of awesome detail, a lot of really great story prompts and story ideas. There's a lot of fun things you can do. There's a lot of hooks for you to build adventures around for whether you're a game master or a player. So anyway, it's a really great book, and the Alpha Quadrant is a wonderful setting, and your games will be richer for it. If you are a Deep Space Nine fan, you've probably already ordered this because it's amazing. If you're not, check out the book, read about the aliens, watch some of the shows, and you will see that this is a wonderful way to play Star Trek Adventures. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you get a chance to try this out, and I will see you on my next review.